Hello friends, good afternoon and dear friends, today's topic for discussion is Indian Constitution and we have in our studios our dear Professor MP Singh. Professor MP Singh is a retired professor in Department of Political Science in University of Delhi. Professor Singh today is going to talk about Indian Constitution, how it was made, its major contours and development that has happened in it. So friends, without further ado, I would like to welcome Professor Singh and request him to start his lecture. Welcome, sir.
Thank you, Amrit. The Constitution of India has been much in debate since November last. I don't mean that it has not been in debate earlier or subsequently, but it has been a subject of greater debate recently because of the fact that the chairman of the drafting committee, Dr. Ambedkar's 125th birth anniversary was celebrated in November. And this month we are going to celebrate the Republic Day of India on the 26th of January from the date from which the commencement of the Constitution was made. Now, the Constitution of India has been one of the great success stories in the universe of constitutions in the world. It is one of the only three constitutions in Asia, I mean Japan, Sri Lanka, and India. These are the three, well, Malaysia can also be counted as one. So, besides Japan, Sri Lanka and Malaysia, the Indian Constitution is the only constitution in the Afro-Asian world that has survived since its commencement in 1950. And for nearly 7 decades, it has been successfully operating in a part of the world where constitutions do not survive for long. They fall by the wayside, the constitutions are set aside, but the Constitution of India is a success story, and for that reason, such a success story must be narrated. Well, mere survival may not be really a big deal, but it's not only survival in our case. In fact, the Constitution and democracy in India are counted as successfully working entities in the global south. So, it's a rare distinction, and we are talking about that rare distinction that India has to its credit. Well, let me say that I am not going to offer a comparative socio-cultural or economic explanation of the Constitution or democracy of India. There are theories that constitutions and democracies work or succeed in a country which is homogeneous. Socio-cultural homogeneity is considered as a precondition for success of democracy. John Stuart Mill, the British political theorist, in fact, greatly emphasized that democracy can succeed only in a country that is socially and culturally homogeneous, and in heterogeneous or a country with great diversities, democracy would not succeed. Similarly, S.M. Lipset, the American sociologist, theorized that for success of democracy, economic prosperity of the country is important. So, these are the two preconditions, one sociological and the other economic, that are considered to be preconditions for success of democracy, and for that reason constitutions or constitutional democracy. India has defied these theories. India has defied these theories in the sense that despite a great deal of diversity in India. In fact, India is perhaps the most diverse country in the world. Culturally and socially, India is most complex, most diverse country in the world. And yet democracy has succeeded in our country. And India is also not a very rich country, although today we have the fastest rate of growth, next only to China. And in the next 10 years, India is estimated to surpass China. So economically, we are a developing democracy. We are in the midst of, we are in a phase of phenomenal economic growth, but at the same time, the rate of economic growth does not ensure the overall pervasive well-being, economic well-being of the population, and we still have a large number of poor, large number of people who are economically deprived. So, but despite these two limitations, Indian democracy and constitutional democracy has made strides, and that is the subject of our discussion today. So, how can we account for this success? I said that in case of India, it is not social precondition, it is not economic precondition that can explain our success. What does explain our success? I would offer two explanations for it, two factors that explain our success. Number one, we have, after independence, we inherited a network of institutions that are crucial to a modern state. After independence, we inherited a minimally representative structure of government from the British rule. Number two, a predominantly bureaucratic state apparatus, a developed bureaucratic apparatus we also inherited, and a hugely popular party of mass appeal in the Indian National Congress, which had led the freedom struggle, freedom movement. So, these three constellation of institutions can explain why we have been so successful. A modicum of representative institutions and a developed bureaucratic state apparatus and a hugely popular nationalist party emerging from the freedom struggle. Another factor for our success and the success of our constitution is the nature of or the process of making of the constitution itself. The Constitution of India was made in 1946-49 by the Constituent Assembly of India, which was specially elected for this purpose, and the process through which the assembly made the constitution, the process through which our makers, the makers of our constitution, the constituent group that created our constitution, the process by which they made it was through consensus. They did not use their predominant majority in the Constituent Assembly. There was a predominant majority of the dominant party, Indian National Congress, in the Constituent Assembly, but instead of using its majority, the makers of the Constitution relied on creating consensus, agreement, and they kept on debating. They went on debating and deliberating unless a modicum of consensus, a modicum of a framework on which all major groups could agree, unless that was reached, they did not decide. So, that is the reason why the Constitution is so widely acceptable to the country. It has been so widely acceptable to the country, and in fact, one of the leading scholars who has studied the Constitution of India, making of the Constitution of India, Granville Austin, he has particularly emphasized that constitution making by consensus is a contribution of India to this exercise, which many other countries have not followed and or do not follow. And since we followed it, we have succeeded. Now, our constitutionalism is one of evolutionary constitutionalism rather than revolutionary constitution. Indian constitution is not the product of a revolution, as the French constitution was, as the American constitution is. In case of France and America, constitutions emerged in those countries after a revolutionary war or after a great revolutionary upheaval. In our case, our constitution has gradually evolved through the British period to the present stage. And so ours is an evolutionary rather than revolutionary constitutionalism. And India avoided the path of revolution because a revolution leads to uncontrolled violence, and generally the historical experience is that revolutions generally produce dictatorships rather than democracy. And that's why we have been wiser in avoiding the revolutionary path. Now, how was the constitution made? As I already pointed out, the Constituent Assembly of India was especially elected for the purpose of making our constitution. Mahatma Gandhi, as early as in 1922, had demanded that the Constituent Assembly of India, which will make the Constitution of Independent India, should be directly elected by the people of India. Direct election of the Constituent Assembly was Gandhi's vision, Gandhi's desire, but that was not to be. It could not be fulfilled because we were under British rule at that point in time, and the British were in control of the government of India, and they had gradually introduced democratic and representative institutions, responsible government in doses, limited doses, federalism in limited doses. So the British authorities, after negotiating with Indian National Congress and the Muslim League, which was the second largest party in colonial India, after an agreement between these two major parties, the British decided that the Constituent Assembly of India would be indirectly elected, not directly elected in which people will directly vote. It would be elected indirectly. Now, who will vote to elect the Constituent Assembly? Under the Cabinet Mission Plan, a British plan, which was accepted by the Congress and the Muslim League, the Constituent Assembly of India was to be elected by the provincial legislatures. At that point in time, provincial legislatures were already in place. The making of the question of constitution making emerged in the late 40s. By that time, provincial legislatures were already in place, and provincial legislatures were elected in 1936 under the Government of India Act 1935. So the provincial legislatures which were already there, they were made the electoral college for the election of the members of the Constituent Assembly. And it was the provincial legislatures were not direct, they were elected on the basis of limited franchise. At that point in time, when the provincial legislatures were elected in 1936, about 28.5% of Indians had acquired voting right. Today, we have cent-per-cent franchise, universal adult franchise. Every adult Indian has a voting right. At that point in time, only 28.5% of Indians had voting right based on property and educational qualifications. So, it was the Constituent Assembly of India was elected indirectly by provincial legislatures, by provincial assemblies, provincial legislatures, and so that was the body that made our Constitution. Now, if you take a look at the party position in the Constituent Assembly, you find that the Indian National Congress had 52.69% of seats. In the Constituent Assembly, the Congress was the largest party with 52.69% of seats. Muslim League was the second largest party with 18.76% of seats, and others accounted for, neither congressmen nor Muslim Leaguers, they accounted for 28.55% of seats. Now, out of these 28.55% of seats, some were nominated, some represented various small parties, and 23.90% of members were nominated by princely rulers, the Rajas, Maharajas and Nawabs. The princely rulers, they were also represented, given representation in the Constituent Assembly, and their nominees accounted for 28.55% of seats in the Constituent Assembly. So, what we find is that the Constituent Assembly had a three-way division: Congress on the one hand, the largest party, Muslim League on the other hand, the second largest party, and then a divided group of a large segment of, in fact, larger than the Muslim League, the divided contingent of the representatives of smaller parties or those nominated by the princely rulers, princely Desi Riyasat or princely states. Now, what is the nature of our Constitution? We have so far briefly introduced how our Constitution was made, who made it. The Constituent Assembly it was not a directly elected body, but it represented practically every section of Indian society. There is one criticism of the Constituent Assembly, that it was not based on universal adult franchise. It was not a widely representative assembly. But the important fact is that it represented practically every segment of Indian society. All sections of Indian society had their representatives there. And one additional point I would like to make, that most constitutions, practically all constitutions of the world, are made by indirectly elected assemblies. Whether it is American Constitution, the Canadian Constitution or Australian Constitution, all constitutions are made by assemblies that were indirectly elected. In fact, Nepal today is the only country whose constitution has been made by a directly elected assembly. So, Nepal is an exception, and there is no time to go into other constitutions at this moment, although our viewers would be aware of the kind of controversies that are raging about the kind of constitution that the Nepalese Constituent Assembly has made. Now, one significant scholar, one significant interpretation of the nature of the Indian Constitution I would like to discuss. I have already referred to Granville Austin, the American historian, who has made perhaps the most thorough, systematic study of the making of the Constitution as well as working of the Constitution in his two books, Granville Austin. Now, Austin, let us see how Austin interprets our Constitution. What is the nature of our Constitution according to Granville Austin? Austin postulates that three features or three goals underlie the Constitution of India. His hypothesis is that the Constitution of India is a seamless web, a seamless network or seamless web that has tried to combine three goals or three values. The first is national unity, the second is social transformation or social revolution, and the third is democracy. So, these are the three cardinal features that the Constitution of India is characterized by according to Granville Austin. Now, what features of the Constitution of India promote national unity? Centralized federal system that the Constitution has established is mainly to promote national unity. Before partition became inevitable, there was a scheme for a system of confederal constitution in which provinces were given a great deal of autonomy. Provinces were given a wide range of powers. In fact, in some respects, provinces or states were more powerful in the earlier scheme, cabinet mission scheme as it is called, cabinet mission proposal as it was called. But when partition became inevitable, when it became decided that India is going to be partitioned between India and Pakistan, then the Constituent Assembly of India decided to establish a federal system with a strong parliamentary center. The quantum of centralization or the quantum of powers given to the center were increased after partition became inevitable, and finally the Constituent Assembly made a constitution with a strong parliamentary center. The provinces or the states were given meaningful autonomy. It was not that they were reduced to the status of municipal corporations. They had meaningful autonomy. They have meaningful autonomy under our Constitution, but to promote national unity, to promote unity of the nation, integrity of the nation, it was thought necessary that the center should have larger degree of control or power or authority in the federal structure. And the Constitution also incorporates a scheme of emergency provisions. There are three kinds of emergencies contemplated in the Constitution: emergency throughout the nation, national emergency, emergency in a particular state, the so-called President's rule, and financial emergency, when the financial condition of the nation is in jeopardy, financial emergency could be declared. So far, no financial emergency has been declared, but national emergency was declared at the time of the Chinese aggression in 1962, and during the emergency in 1975-77, Prime Minister Indira Gandhi had declared internal national emergency, and a state emergency or president's rule when the government of a state cannot be carried out according to the provisions of the constitution on either on the report of the governor or in his own discretion. The president may decide to take over the administration of a state, and president's rule is imposed. Now, all these features are in pursuit of national unity. To promote national unity and integrity, these features of the constitution were incorporated. Now, the second cardinal value of our constitution is called social revolution by Granville Austin. Granville Austin uses the word revolution, which is rhetorical. The reality is that our approach is not revolutionary. Our approach is social transformation through legal means or social transformation through law, mechanism of law. But we incorporated very significant provisions aimed at social transformation, change in revolutionary proportions. And if you examine the fundamental rights and the directive principles of a state policy in the Constitution, you will realize how the Constitution of India is greatly committed to basic fundamental equality in a caste and class divided society. The caste and varna and caste hierarchies or class disparities, in order to reduce them, in order to bring every Indian to a reasonable level of equality in the society, fundamental rights and directive principles. Fundamental rights give rights to individuals and certain communities, and directive principles propose in a prescriptive way, if not legally enforceable immediately, at least the directive principles put forward the goal of ensuring social security to the unemployed, to the weak, to the sick, to the children, to women and other weaker sections of the society. And democracy is the third feature of our Constitution. Where is evident this value? Where do we find the value of democracy incorporated in our Constitution? If you examine the structure of government established in the Constitution, you find that every government, whether local, state or national, every government is to be democratically elected at stated intervals. At 5 yearly intervals, elections are held for the Assembly and National Parliament, and the governments are democratically constituted. And at the local level again, panchayats and municipal corporations are subject to electoral legitimization of their rule. So, the structure of government, if you closely examine, you find that we have representative government as well as a responsible government. Representative government and responsible government both are features of democratic government. Both are features of democracy. Representative government means that every legislator, every MP, every MLA, every panchayat committee member represents certain sections of the society, certain territorial communities. Territorial communities are given representation to the parliament, to the state legislatures, to the local councils. So, that is the representative part of democracy, and responsible part of democracy is there where the executive is made accountable to the legislature. The cabinet at national as well as state level, cabinet or the executive of the government or the cabinet council of ministers is made responsible to the popular chamber of the legislative branch. Only so long as the Lok Sabha reposes trust or confidence in the government, a government is in office, otherwise it must go out. And only a majority support in the Lok Sabha enables a party or a coalition to form a government, and only sustained confidence of the House, popular chamber of the parliament, ensures the survival of a government. So, the democratic value or the democratic feature is evident both in the representative character of the government as well as responsible or accountable nature of the executive to the elected legislators. Now, let us refer to another scholar who has studied, who has commented on our system of government in the Constitution. Ronald Watts, a great Canadian federalist, a great expert of federalism in Canada. Ronald Watts stipulates or hypothesizes that our Constitution, our form of the form of government introduced by the Indian Constitution is parliamentary federal, in which parliamentary principle or parliamentary component has been given preeminence over the federal component. This is Ronald Watts' interpretation. This point in some other words we have already referred to earlier, but Ronald Watts, who is a Canadian comparative federal theorist, who has studied all federal systems of the world including our own, and in his view parliamentary nature of our Constitution is parliamentary federal, and when he says that our Constitution is parliamentary federal, he is contrasting it with presidential federal constitution of the USA or Switzerland. The constitutions of USA and Switzerland are presidential federal, not parliamentary federal. There is difference between parliamentary form of government and presidential form of government. In presidential America, in presidential federal constitution of America, every branch of government or every organ of the government has fixed tenure. The president is elected for 4 years and he cannot be removed unless there is an impeachment. The chambers of the American Congress also have fixed terms, and before that the president cannot dissolve them, which is not the case in India, because being a parliamentary system, parliamentary component of the government can be often dissolved, or re-elections can be ordered. That is not the case in America. So, there is difference between presidential federalism and parliamentary federalism, and ours is a system of parliamentary federalism. In this respect, it is important to point out that we belong to the Commonwealth family of parliamentary federal constitutions. The first parliamentary federal constitution was made in Canada in 1867, and then followed the Australian Constitution in 1901, and then the Indian Constitution in 1949 and 1950. So, we belong to the Commonwealth family of parliamentary federal constitutions. Now, Ronald Watts also makes the point that over the years, over the decades, the Indian Constitution or the working of the Indian Constitution has gradually become more and more federalized. The Nehru government, the Indira Gandhi government were not so federally oriented. During their times, it was the parliamentary centralism that prevailed in the working of the system. But now we are living in an era when parliamentary centralism has become constrained by the growth of regional parties, growth of regional forces in the country, and with regionalization of the party system, the state governments have acquired greater autonomy, because there was a time when all governments, national as well as state, were formed by one party, dominated by one party, the Indian National Congress. Now a large number of parties are in power at the national level. If the Lok Sabha is dominated by one coalition, the Rajya Sabha is dominated by coalition of other parties, and if center is controlled by one particular coalition of parties, various state governments are formed by a large number of other parties or coalitions of parties. So Watts makes the point that over the decades, India, which started its career as a predominantly parliamentary federal system, has gradually become more open to regional forces, and states in Indian constitution, states under the Indian political system have gradually acquired greater and greater autonomy. And in fact, one scholar, Douglas Verney is another Canadian expert of federalism who has written on India, Canada and USA. And Verney has in fact made a point that India started as a quasi-federal system. Quasi-federal is a term that was used by K.C. Weir. K.C. Weir, the Australia-born federal theorist who worked in the United Kingdom, wrote a book, Federal Government, in which he characterized Indian constitution as quasi-federal and Indian political system also as quasi-federal. His thesis was that the constitution was quasi-federal as well as actual working of the government was also quasi-federal, and that was his conclusion until the Nehru government. The last edition of his book was published when Prime Minister Nehru was still alive, and his argument was that the Constitution of India is quasi-federal as well as Government of India in its actual working is quasi-federal, half federal, not fully federal. Whereas in that very book, Watts argued that the Constitution of Canada was federal, but quasi-federal. Constitution of Canada was quasi-federal, but actual working of the Canadian government had become federal, after the Second World War. So K.C. Weir's characterization that Indian constitution and system was quasi-federal, that was the starting point, and Douglas Verney made the point that starting in that way, by 1989 or so, after 1989 elections, after 1989 Lok Sabha election, India became quasi-confederacy. This is the word used by Douglas Verney, that India is no longer quasi-federal or non-federal. India has become quasi-confederacy. There is difference between federal and confederal system. In a federal system, the center is stronger. In a confederal system, states are more powerful. And Douglas Burney made this point. He, he stuck his neck out and argued that at in post 1989 period, the working of the Indian political system displayed that the state governments in some ways had become more powerful than the federal government. There was a time when prime ministers dismissed chief ministers, and in post 1989 period, there are instances where regional parties and regional leaders are made or unmade prime ministers. Prime ministers were made or unmade, federal governments were made or unmade by state governments during the era of coalition governments. It is only since 2014 that Prime Minister Narendra Modi has been able to mobilize, bring about an electoral realignment in the country, and he managed to win a majority for the BJP, a single party majority. And when the BJP got the Modi majority in 2014, it was after 30 long years. Before that, the last time such a government was elected, a majority party government was elected, was in 1984, when Rajiv Gandhi had scored a landslide victory for the Congress. After that, we have had we didn't have any majority party in the parliament. And the BJP today is, the first majority party in the parliament after 30 long years. So this is how, I wanted to discuss some of the scholarly, commentaries on the Constitution as well as the working of the Constitution, and we would move on to make some other points relating to our Constitution. Let me refer to my own interpretation of the Indian Constitution. In one of my books, Indian Federalism, I have argued that our Constitution is product of three political contracts. Our Constitution represents three political contracts. Number one, a contract between we the people of India and the governments in India. The first contract our Constitution represents, as you know, the preamble to the Constitution of India begins with the ringing declaration that we the people of India are the source of all political power. So my argument is that the first political contract that Indian Constitution represents is that between we the people of India, the source of all political power, and the governments of India, federal and state, to whom we give power through our electoral decision. The second contract that is implicit in the Constitution of India is that between the three organs of the government at national as well as state levels, the three organs of the government, the legislature, the executive and the judiciary. The three organs of the government have specific powers and roles. Legislature, broadly speaking, legislature legislates, makes laws. The executive executes laws, enforces laws, and judiciary, the judiciary adjudicates the disputes between organs of the governments or the levels of the government, whether federal or state or in fact local as well. And the third implicit contract in our Constitution, in fact explicit, not implicit, the third explicit contract in our constitution is between the union and state governments. The powers of the union government and those of the state governments are meticulously demarcated, divided in the 7th schedule of the constitution. The exclusive powers of the union or overriding powers of the union or exclusive powers of the union are enumerated in the union list. Exclusive powers of the state legislatures are enumerated in the state list, and concurrent list includes subjects on which both the national parliament and state legislatures can make laws. But in case of conflict, the union law prevails. So, these three contracts are there nestling in the Constitution of India, and that gives our constitution the plurality and federality of powers and checks and balances that we find in our system working in favor of democracy, working to promote democracy, working to promote individual and community rights. Now, our constitution is a multicultural secular constitution. Now, this is another feature that I would briefly comment on. Our secularism, our secular constitutionalism is evolutionary rather than revolutionary. That's the first point I would like to make. Revolutionary secularism is evident in France or in the USA, where the constitutions of those countries put a wall of separation between the state and the church, between a state and religion. A state is completely debarred from meddling in religious affairs in those secular constitutions. Now, so the French and American secularism are different. I call them revolutionary secularism. Our secularism is different, and I call it evolutionary secularism, in the sense that our constitutionalism is evolutionary, much like the British secularism. In Britain, for all practical purposes, the British constitution is secular. Every British subject has secular freedoms, but even today, the crown of England can be worn only by a Catholic. Only by a Protestant. Only a Protestant can wear the crown of England, not a Catholic Christian or not a member of any other religious community. And the Archbishop of Canterbury, there is an official Church of England, the Church of England, Anglican Church of England, which is called the Church of England, is an official state church, and Archbishop of Canterbury draws salary from a state treasury as a state official. And yet, for all practical purposes, Britain has become a secular country. Our constitution is more or less similar in nature. So, we are evolutionary secular country in the sense that for all practical purposes, we have all the secular freedoms and guarantees, yet the legislature or the state is not debarred from legislating on religious affairs. In fact, many laws, in fact, the constitution exhorts, the constitution expects the government of India to introduce universal, common civil code. Common civil code, our family laws, property laws are based on religious, different religious communities have their family laws and property succession laws governed by, religion-based laws, traditional laws. The constitution, in fact, has set it as an ideal in the directive principles of state policy to introduce universal common civil code. Criminal code was made common for all Indians belonging to any religious community. Similarly, common civil code that was made by Lord Macaulay in 1860s, and we have not yet introduced this constitutional ideal, and in fact because of the evolutionary nature of our secular country, our secular state, because of evolutionary nature of our secularism, the state of India, the state in India maintains a principled distance from religious affairs and expects that unless religious communities themselves come forward for reform and request the state to legislate, the state has so far not moved in that direction. So, so our secularism is different from the American and French secularism, which is a revolutionary secularism, and ours and British secularism are evolutionary secularism, but for all practical purposes we are secular states, we are secular societies. If at least the state is secular, if not society, and the state, it is the responsibility of the state to promote secularism in culture and society of India. Now, another important feature of the Constitution of India is what may be called asymmetrical features. Our federal system is largely symmetrical in the sense that every federating unit has equal status, every state has equal status, but asymmetrical features were considered necessary in some exceptional cases, as in the case of Jammu and Kashmir, as in case of Nagaland, as in the case of some northeastern tribal communities. So Jammu and Kashmir, Nagaland, and some other tribal states in the northeast have been given, have been recognized by the Constitution itself in terms of some specific requirements. The historical nature of integration of Jammu and Kashmir with India required Article 370, and the desire of the makers of the Indian Constitution to protect tribal customs and traditions in the northeast prompted them to give exceptional asymmetrical tribal protection laws, tribal modes of governance under the 5th schedule and the 6th schedule. The 5th schedule, tribal communities in the bulk of the country, mainland country, and the 6th schedule relates to Assam, Meghalaya, Tripura and Mizoram. These 4 states are governed by the 6th schedule provisions which guarantee tribal modes of governance in those parts of the country. There has been demand for abolition of Article 370, because the Constitution itself has said that it is a provisional feature, it is a temporary feature of the Constitution, but for 7 decades almost, we have found it necessary for the sake of national consensus to not to abolish this provisional feature of the Constitution, and it is very significant for the identity of our compatriots in Jammu and Kashmir. They are quite sensitive about this article, and national consensus has continued to extend this provision, and it appears that in the foreseeable future it will continue to be part of our constitutional principle and practice. Local self-government, since there are no questions, perhaps I can continue.
Sir, very shortly.
Oh, okay. Local self-government, one general comment let me make very quickly, that the Gandhian approach of Gram Swaraj has not been incorporated in the Constitution of India. Gandhi had a very strong vision of village self-rule, Gram Swaraj, whereby power would spring from the villages of India and move upwards to the state and national level. In fact, the Constitution, Constitution grants limited power to the center, to the states, and to the local self-governing institutions, and the structure is hierarchical rather than in the Gandhian mode of radical vision of Gram Swaraj. But at the same time, there are developments which I have no time to discuss. There are developments which suggest that the 73rd and 74th constitutional amendments and a case decided by the Andhra Pradesh High Court suggests that no part of the constitution is superfluous and the local self-governing institutions should be given their due, even though their status is not federal in constitutional terms, only devolutionary in constitutional terms, but there is a strong sentiment that they deserve to be made a third tier of our federal structure. I suppose, let me conclude on this point.
Sir, thank you for this lecture, and we hope that we will hear more from you on Indian Constitution. And I would like to thank you, Professor MP Singh, for coming to our studios, and thank you friends for watching. Stay tuned and keep watching. Thank you.
Thank you very much.